big thing that I learned from these novels was the big lesson that I took was about structure. So let me just kind of explain how that all went. So the first novels that I wrote were all based on pre-existing stories. Like I wrote a novel based on some Greek tragedies, Oedipus Rex and Medea. I wrote some historical fiction based on the death of Joan of Arc and the Battle of Little Bighorn. I wrote some kind of quasi-fantasy story about Ernest Shackleton escaping Antarctica. The thing that all these story ideas have in common is that they were all based on stories that already existed. So I always could think to myself, like, these stories have succeeded. These are incredible stories. And so I can always just fall back on those. Like, if the story isn't working, I'll just go back to the source material. Now, the problem is when you have that as a strategy is when you have to depart in any way from the source material, you got to ask yourself, why am I departing from the source material? Like, what is the kind of theory that I have here for this departure? I want to make it more interesting in some way, more gripping. I want to make it more exciting, more engaging for the reader. But why? Why is something engaging to a reader? Why is something gripping? Why does something belong in a story or not belong in it? And I realized, having written these 6 novels, that I had no idea how to answer that question. I didn't have any kind of grounding other than I just like books and I enjoy the process of writing. And so it was a really dark period that I went through after the 6th of those novels, which was the one that I'd written about, rewrite of the Euripides play Medea set in New York City. After that, I really went deep into story theory so I could begin to stand on my own 2 feet and think, why do I like telling the stories that I like? And how can I invent from scratch my own kinds of stories? And so that I read everybody. I mean, we're talking about Robert McKee and Chris Vogler, and there's a bunch of great other teachers that I could recommend. People like K.M. Weiland, who has a website called Helping Writers Become Authors. I took courses with Gene Cavellos at the Odyssey Writing Workshop. There's a wonderful Russian folklore theorist called Vladimir Propp, P-R-O-P-P. These are some of my absolute favorite theorizers of how to put together compelling stories. And I just studied and studied and studied until I felt like I had a way of storytelling that was both compelling and also felt authentic to me.
Okay. So I want to interrupt and I want to clarify a point that I think you're making, which is that, first of all, you sort of got humble. Like after 6 novels that didn't work, you realized that you did not know how to structure a novel.
Exactly.
And that you were lacking like a foundation, as you said, in the fundamentals of storytelling and what makes a story work. But this is a bit of a nebulous terrain. There are a lot of people out there who have a formula. There are a lot of people out there who claim to know what makes a good story a good story. And their theories are not without value. Their formulas are not without value. Some of this stuff can be really helpful. But what it sounds like you did was you got humble, you went out, you tried to learn, you sort of tasted a lot of different theories, and then you took what worked for you, what you liked, and you built your own.
I think so. I mean, I think there was a fundamental question there, which is like, why am I even telling a story at all? Why I like writing. Why don't I write essays? Why don't I write poetry? Why don't I write, nonfiction of some nonfiction books, right? Why is a fiction story the thing for me? What can that deliver that I seem really like I want to deliver? And I think the answer to that is fiction delivers emotion. It delivers powerful, powerful emotion. It's a great vehicle for that. That's what I look for in books. That's what I want. And so it really started with that. Like, why am I even in this business at all of doing the storytelling? And then the question was kind of which theories help me deliver that emotion, the kind of emotion that I want to deliver. And I just really want to caveat this, Brad. Every writer who has story writing ideas and every story theorist who has story structure theories that they want to sell, they feel convinced about their own ideas. I mean, most of these theorists are highly confident. And I feel highly confident as well, but I want to make sure you understand what I mean by that. I feel highly confident that my way of telling stories is good for me and the kind of emotions that I like to create. I feel like I have a sort of playbook for myself that works for kind of creating the kinds of emotions that I create. Like your wonderful book, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. The kinds of emotions that you're creating in that book are not the kind of emotions that I know how to create with my fiction. And therefore, probably not all or not even many of my structural ideas would be a fit for your kind of suite of emotions that you're creating with your art. So just the big caveat that I would just say to people when they're listening to me talk about my ideas, and to the extent that I sound strident in what I believe, it's because for me, these are hard-won principles. But for you, the listener, just think about, does this give you energy? Does the thing that you're hearing me say make you want to go write more and want to go attack your project in some kind of new way? And if it does, then great. But if it makes you sort of feel dead inside and it makes you feel like, oh, Mark's just talking about some formula, it makes no sense to me, sort of immediately forget that I said it. It's all about what gives your art energy. And these are things that give my art energy.
And I think there are, though, like I agree. I think we all have a kind of bespoke way of approaching this, and that's as it should be. But there are some fundamentals of story structure and good storytelling that I think are applicable across the board, or mostly across the board. And I was listening to you talk about your early failed novels that were largely based on history, right? I've said this so many times on this show, how much I envy writers of historical fiction because the plot and the structure is sort of ready-made. That's a good instinct, if nothing else. If you're not sure how to structure a novel,
Right.
taking an event in history and trying to build a narrative into it, you could do worse. But what was lacking again? Was it the emotion? Like you had the basic framework, but it wasn't enough.
Well, there's a lot of things that were lacking and a lot of things that just come from practice. I mean, that beyond story structure, just me as a writer who needed to grow up. But I think one way to put it is, especially when I was rewriting things like Medea and Oedipus Rex, is that when you're dealing with, especially with rewriting another great work of art, um, there's a lot of feelings and emotions that are created by those works of art. And I think a sort of trap that people can run into is that they are very moved by, say, Medea. And then they're like, I want to recreate those same emotions, the emotions that Euripides was creating, right? And then you want to kind of create those emotions too. But the thing is, they're sort of borrowed emotions, right? You're sort of taking the emotions that Euripides was so great in creating and kind of doing a kind of slant version of it, right? And I just feel like with some of the kind of theories that I have now, I'm just like, these are stories, like when I tell a story my way with my methods, it creates emotions that are the emotions that I like to create and that are kind of just so genuine to me. And one of the most satisfying things about art is being able to pass emotion from one person to the other. And now I'm not kind of taking a secondhand Euripides emotion and passing it on to you. I'm taking a Mark Cecil emotion and passing it on to you. So it's more authentic.
And there is a distinction that you make between what you call book matter and story matter in any novel. Like, this is a key distinction.
It is. Yeah. So this is, I spent so much time kind of debating structure with other writers in my community, that I eventually had to kind of come up with this, idea of separating these two things, book matter and story matter. And, book matter is like anything that can appear in a book, because literally the novel is just the most versatile of printed forms. I mean, you can put lists and poems and data and pictures and essays and descriptions, dialogue, anything you want can technically go into a novel, right? So that all of that is what I would call book matter, just matter that is in a book. Now, story matter is different. Story matter is things that pertain to the character going through their story. And to me, I am most moved by stories. I read for stories. And again, this is just yet another kind of caveat that, like, some people read for language. Okay. Some people read for a sense of place. Some people read to learn about history. There's all kinds of reasons why people like reading certain kinds of novels. Me personally, I like to read for story. I have what's called, in my writing workshop that I'm in, we call it secondary character blindness. And so what that is that I very much I'm focused on the protagonist. I have a little bit of a harder time as a reader with multiple points of view. And again, I mean, multiple points of view books that's like a massive part of the market, right? But me, I'm always just laser focused on, okay, you've told me who the main character is. What are they going through? How are they going to get through it? Why do they want what they want? How are they going to get it? All that kind of stuff. So that's what I would call story matter. And for me as a reader, the more a writer kind of gets off the story matter and more into book matter, I just sort of get a little bit more lost.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes writers do that because they themselves are lost. I've done that.
Right.
It's an easy kind of like reflexive thing to do when you're struggling with the plot of a novel or you're hitting some kind of creative impasse with it, to sort of revert to book matter and to get into sidebars and subplots, or to suddenly drop a list into it or something. And that can be a distraction, and it can kind of kill the propulsiveness of a novel, and it can make a reader put the book down. And just to clarify, story matter is fundamentally about change. It's about the character changing, right?
Yes. Now, this is a kind of tricky, nuanced thing. I mean, I think broadly speaking, a story is about how people change, but there is a nuance there that you could say that characters are revealed, right? Like, does a person ever actually change? This is sort of a kind of deeper question about psychology and our biology. Like, does anybody actually change, or do they go through circumstances that reveal different parts of themselves? So they start to live in a different kind of way. And so they have sort of changed, but it actually did it just to reveal a side of them that was sort of always there, but hidden. Anyway, that's sort of like a sidebar debate. But yeah, I mean, I think stories are effectively about how somebody changes. They're sort of going along in a certain way, and then something happens. Either something happens to them, something happens to a loved one, and then they have to change their lives in some way. And then in the end of the story, it is either changed or not changed. And I just want to say, just another point of clarification, that it's not that every novel is just about one character who goes through a change. It's like, because somebody might say to me okay, so what's the 3-act structure of War and Peace, or like Breaking Bad or something, right? Well, I'm just saying that every sort of beat of a story is about this kind of change. Like, you're sort of in one situation, and then you move through to a different situation. So in these masterpieces that are huge, and thousands of pages long and 80 episodes long, there's many, 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 many arcs. And I'm just everything that I'm going to be talking about on today's show is more about kind of like just plotting one character arc, but any book can have many of those.
I mean, you're kind of, when you do though, write a book with many character arcs and many different characters going through cycles of change, aren't you giving yourself a much bigger job? It seems like one is hard enough.
It is. It really is. But yeah, I mean, I think it's far more simple to just think about one character. And me with secondary character blindness, that's kind of inevitably how I receive stories anyway. But yeah, it's really hard to do one. But, Pixar is a great example. And I know I keep bringing up TV and movies, but it's just often because that's like a common point of reference for people. But Pixar is like sort of the world-class champion of like multiple arcs per film. Like the Toy Story movies are just incredible. Like everybody gets an arc in those things. There's 5-6 different character arcs.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. Pixar has always fascinated me because of the precision afforded by digital animation and by that particular filmmaking process, which doesn't involve obviously any live actors. And you're allowed then, I think, to pursue a level of perfection that you might not have access to with the variability presented by live actors and all the stuff that entails. But Pixar has done, in many of its films anyways, an excellent job of really polishing it's storytelling, right? I mean, it's like some of these films just feel note perfect.
They are I mean, I think there's a guy named Michael Arndt who won an Oscar for Little Miss Sunshine, and then he got an offer to go do Toy Story 3, and he led the creative team that made Toy Story 3, which then he also won a second Oscar for. And there's a wonderful film online that I would recommend to anybody. Michael Arndt is really a really influential figure for me in terms of his theories about storytelling. But he has one film that's just for free on YouTube called like The Making of Toy Story 3 or something. And he talks about the actual process at Pixar. Like, how was that film made, or how was it written, more like from the screenwriter's perspective. And yeah, I mean, they have like this kind of relentless, really pitiless and somewhat terrifying process of like this iterative bringing in one screenplay after another and again and again, and for 3 years, and you got 10 writers working for you, and after 3 years it's still not working. And I mean, I think that movie is a masterpiece, Toy Story 3, but it took 10 people working for 3 years to get that script where it was.
Yeah, I read a book, and I'm going to forget the guy's name. I know the name of the book is Creativity Inc.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
it's by one of the founders, I believe, of Pixar, and he kind of breaks down the creative process there, and I found it really useful to read about as a writer. I would recommend it, even if you're not interested in animation or even filmmaking. Like, just as a writer of books, I found it useful because they are so committed. It's kind of like Steve Jobs owned Pixar, right? So it's kind of like a
Yeah.
Jobsian approach to filmmaking, like
Yeah.
incredibly iterative and neurotic and committed to perfection and willing to kind of, like you say, hire 10 writers, write a million drafts, refuse to accept anything other than close to perfect.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think Pixar gets it right all the time. I mean, I think like, especially lately, I just feel like maybe they've lost a little bit of the magic. But I just want to say like one other thing, just generally about structure that I'm thinking of right now, thinking about Pixar. In my neck of the woods up here in Boston, I'm in, a writer community here and give feedback to people. They give feedback to me. And I'm known as like the structure guy. And it's funny because it's not really a compliment to be known as the structure guy in a writing community. And I think this is super interesting. And I always feel like slightly defensive. And I feel like it's like slightly derisive when somebody's like, oh yeah, talk to Mark. He knows a lot about structure. And I just think it's so interesting. So at the risk of getting on my soapbox for a second, like the first point is I think that like a lot of people see literature as kind of an oasis. From Hollywood or from, other kind of like more rigorous storytelling industries, like with a capital I. And they feel like literary fiction is a place where you don't have to follow the rules and you can make it challenging for the readers, with air quotes. And so people just feel like it's almost annoying that someone like me, who considers myself an author of literary fiction, would like be harping on these ideas. But the one point I want to just say about that is that like outlining and structure and structural analysis and kind of like workshopping the beats of your story rather than workshopping like prose, all this stuff that Pixar does, it's all totally creative. I just like don't understand why like writing a great sentence, like a perfectly engineered sentence, is considered in literary terms like, oh, that's creative, that's literary. But creating a really like airtight, like awesome, compelling story, like that's somehow less than. And I just, for the life of me, like cannot understand it. And the last point I'll make about it is when I am outlining, and I sometimes even outline in Excel, I mean, I have chapters on the manuscript that I'm working on right now. I have chapters that will ultimately be like 1,000 words long that have like a 10,000 word kind of cumulative outline just for that chapter. Like all my notes about how to make this chapter work are like 10,000 words, and the chapter will be 1,000 words. This process of structuring even just a chapter in this totally compelling way is, to me, completely creatively fulfilling, and is just as creative as writing a great sentence. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I think that filmmaking, especially when it's done well, because screenwriting is such a defined form, or the screenplay is such a defined form, has so much to teach writers of literary fiction who might struggle with structure and with plot. because there are certain things that we are conditioned to expect from good storytelling. And when a writer of a screenplay or of a novel hits those marks, it works on the reader in a psychological way that is deeply satisfying. And I don't know, I think cross-pollination is great. I don't think
Yeah.
you should look down your nose at genre fiction or look down your nose at screenwriting if you're a writer of literary fiction, and vice versa, right? I
Yep.
think that the different genres or different ways of approaching it have a lot to teach each other. And when it comes to writers of literary fiction, I think sometimes you will have people put their guard up because they think that to engage with storytelling conventions or fundamentals or tropes somehow uh, infringes upon, what's the word? Upon their originality.
I think both. I think they both sound good.
Yeah. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, oh no, I'm original. I'm doing something that sort of is more experimental and has less to do with commercial storytelling. This is a character study. This is a tone poem, whatever you want to call it. And what is the relationship between originality and convention as you see it when it comes to story structure?
Oh my God. I mean, this is just getting right to the heart of it for me. Like I just get so worked up about the story structure stuff. Okay. So to me, there are no new ideas under the sun. That is truly what I believe. And if you don't believe me, I can prove it to you. Just think to yourself, what kind of story am I writing? I am writing a queer coming of age story. I am writing a story about an affair in a marriage. I am writing a story about a serial killer, whatever it is. But then you're like, well, it's also got, fairies and dragons in it, whatever it may be. Put go to a website called tvtropes.org, and then just plug a few words of what your story is about into the search field. And you will see that there are pages upon countless pages about whatever story idea you have, even just whatever word you put in. You will find a day's worth of links about every show, book, movie, play that's been written over the last 4,000 years that touches on that. And then you will see that like your super original idea that like this time it's going to be like the woman who does it instead of the man. Well, there's going to be about 8 hours worth of material about when the woman does it instead of the man. I have lost, and I don't want to say lost, I have gained whole days like on this website. I think tvtropes.org, if you can brave it, is one of the most helpful websites on the internet to a writer. And let me just explain why, because I think it would be terrifying to people. Because the first thing that tvtropes.org is going to do is it's going to expose the fact that the kind of story that you're thinking of has been done ish in one way or another. And that this is not, the place I'm going with this is not, you are not original, because I think what everybody does ultimately is original. But originality lies on the other side of being informed about what you're doing. So, the thing about TV tropes and conventions and just all kinds of like story genres is that, to me, the analogy is it's like a language. Like, for example, if somebody's good at speaking, like you say, I met somebody and they're very good at speaking the English language. That's not what you don't mean is like they made up a bunch of new words. Like they call an apple a boogity boo and they call a painting a gabadi ba, right? When you're good at speaking, it's not because you've made up a bunch of new stuff. It's because you've taken the existing words in the English language and rearranged them in a very interesting way, in a way that doesn't sound really like other people. But the words themselves are not original. And so if you follow this analogy, like for the tropes and the conventions, it's like, okay, you're writing a rom-com. So, there's going to be a moment in your romantic comedy where the couple meets. If they don't meet, it's just not a rom-com. It might be something else, but it's not a romance. Okay. And so the question is not like, are you going to invent a bunch of new tropes that nobody's ever heard of? The question is, what order are you placing the tropes in, and how are you twisting it and making it original? So anyway, all of which is to say that I just think like people just need to relax a little bit about being original. And I think it's the productive side of it is, I think when somebody gets a head of steam about a project, like, I mean, I think I'm really a big fan of like when somebody's like, I want to write a book, I've got this great idea. You don't have to know what genre it is then. The important thing is just to gush, right? Just go with the energy, write a crazy first draft, get like as far as you can just on the fuel in your guts. And I think the best time to think about structure and tropes and all these things is sort of like when it's all kind of like vomited out of you. Then you're like, wait a second, like, what kind of story is this? And then you're like, oh, there are two people meeting and sort of the end is about how they fall in love or don't fall in love. I'm probably sort of near the romance genre here, or like the relationship genre. So why don't I just do some research on that? And what will happen is you'll see like, oh, in a normal romantic comedy, just because we've been talking about that, there's probably like 10 or 12 beats, right? There's like the part where they meet, and then it's the part where they break up, and then there's the part where they finally get back together. And like, oh, I realized I didn't have the part where they break up. And like, could that make a good scene for me? Maybe it could. And the whole point of this, Brad, I'm sorry for this grand tirade here, but it's like the whole point of this is just that tropes and conventions can be actually generative for you. It's not like you're starting out like, I'm going to steal all the beats and you don't have any juice in your tank at all. It's like, yeah, you've got plenty of original juice, but then you're going to like sort of like use some of the conventions that are available to you to say like, oh, I could really heighten this scene over here, or I'm missing a kind of stock character. Like, oh, like the main character doesn't have a best friend in my rom-com. Oh, like I could add a best friend. That might help, or not. But it's just all a way that being informed about the conventions and then using those conventions to kind of help bolster your original idea is where the real gold is.
Well, and I think understanding the tropes and understanding the different genres and maybe what some of the fundamentals are for each one respectively, those are arrows in your quiver, right? Like instead of pushing that stuff away and kind of refusing it on some philosophical ground, it's better and probably to your advantage to engage with it, understand it, take what works, leave what doesn't work. And another thing that I would add to understanding genre and understanding storytelling tropes within each different tradition is that I often find most satisfying movies, books, television shows that blend tropes and genres and that, what do you call it, cross-pollinate.
Yeah.
So, like, just to give an example, you could have some sort of true crime serial killer narrative that is also a romantic comedy.
Yes.
Like suddenly you're colliding these things in interesting ways. And that, I think, is where you are taking advantage of convention and also making it new by finding creative ways to blend and using the different tropes kind of in opposition to one another, like taking advantage of the tension. Like, how do you fall in love while you're searching for a serial killer? You know what I'm saying? Like you're engaged in this grim work, but you're also met the love of your life or something, you know. But,
well, I mean, look at like Silence of the Lambs, for example, just comes to mind, right? There is a kind of like seductive thing that's going on in that story. But yeah, the point is not like, so you're saying it exactly right, which is just like, so say you have a procedural kind of detective thing mixed with a romance, right? Well, great. So that actually might be more original, but then you just got to think like, well, for the procedural aspect, let's research that. For the romantic aspect, let's research those conventions, and then, you know, find a way to like kind of interweave the beats. Then you're like well on your way. But that would be opposed to somebody saying like, I'm just doing something totally original. It's sort of a detective and a romance, but it's like nothing else. Like the resources are there for you. Just find out about the beats and use whichever ones you want.
Yeah. And so there is often in conversations about structure in storytelling, dichotomy drawn between the plotter and the pantser. Can you define this for people who might not know about it or might have forgotten?
Yes. So I think this is like one of the most useless kind of, binaries that there are. But so the plotter and the pantser is somebody who plots and like is a real structuralist. Like I would sort of be a classic plotter. Some people might say, but I'll get to the nuance in a moment.
But like, or an outliner. A plotter would be an outliner.
Yes. Yeah. And then a pantser is somebody who kind of like writes by the seat of their pants, quote unquote. The other kind of binary that's used is gatherers versus gardeners, right? Like a gardener is somebody who plans, I'm going to plant the cucumbers here and the tomatoes here, and they're going to grow in this order. And then the gatherer, by contrast, is somebody who just goes out in the woods and just kind of gathers whatever, like forages, right? And so these are people who, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to interrupt because I think that you can do it either way. In
Yeah.
my experience, both as a writer and as somebody who's talked to a lot of writers. And I just want to say, since you are a gardener, you are a plotter, that I just had a conversation on this show with Alexandra Tanner, who has a great debut novel out called Worry. And I mean, she may contest this, but as I recall the conversation, she was telling me about a document that she keeps, which she referred to as a candy bag, where she was just jotting down things that she would want to include in the book, an exchange she might have had in real life that she could then fictionalize, something she had saw, an observation, a funny thought, just somebody keeping kind of a loose document, this candy bag document of things she may or may not want to put in the book. That's different than plotting. That's different than sitting down and writing a more formal outline. But I think in some ways they serve the same purpose, but that's a gatherer, right? The candy bag that strikes me as a gathering process, right?
It is, but and this is where it just all breaks down for me because, like, so for example, even though I might be viewed as like some extreme plotter, it's like I do a very similar thing process wise as the candy bag. For the book I'm working on now, I was sort of stuck, even though I had fully outlined my book. I was like stuck, and I felt like my outline was sort of dead, and I had come to a point where I just sort of didn't want to write in the same exact direction as I had planned. So what I did was I made a list of like as many, like it must have been a list of about 30 or 40 scenes that I would like just love to write, right? Some that were in my outline that I was sort of like, I mean, I know I'll get there. I mean, some it's like from like the very last scene of the book, right? Just sort of, I can't have my story without this scene. And then others that were just like, I think it might be fun to write that. And so during this period of me being stuck halfway through my book, I would just go into this document and scan through and just find a scene that I wanted to write, no matter whether it belonged in the book or not. And then I would just write that scene because that felt good to me. A friend of mine, when I told him about this, called like the mosaic approach to writing. And so all of which is to say, Brad, that like, I think it's just a false dichotomy. And I think everybody does both. Certainly I do both. I love outlining. And as I said before, I found outlining totally creative and interesting and challenging. But I also break with my outlines all the time. And as soon as my outline is not working, I immediately abandon it. And it doesn't mean like I'm a slave to my outline. It just means I like outlining. And I also like getting in there and actually writing the scenes and doing this more kind of like, let's see what will happen today as I write the scene. So the analogy that I use that I think is sort of far more apt and that kind of includes all writers is like a ship's captain trying to find a foreign land. And so if you're a ship's captain, you're like, I'm going to go find a new territory. And that's like your completed novel. Every day you're like looking at your map of the stars and everything. This is an old fashioned ship's captain. And you're heading off to this like northwest, say, the land lies to the northwest and it's going to take us a year to get there. But every day there's also like a whale ramming into your ship or a storm or some island that wasn't on your map that's in your way. And so on a day by day basis, you're sort of being creative and dealing with whatever is coming up in the moment. But you're always also kind of adjusting your map and like, I'm still going to that place that's 1,000 miles away. And so all I'm trying to say is it's both. I think every writer, even when they say they're a pure gatherer, they have some idea of where they're headed. And me, a radical like plotter, I am willing to change where I'm going all the time and adjust my long-term plans.
Yeah, I think that the people who are pantsers, the people who kind of write intuitively and feel their way through the darkness, usually, but not always, have a sense of an ending, if nothing else. So they know what they're working toward. They have no idea what's going to happen along the way. They make that up day by day, but they do have a sense of an ending. And I think if you're not going to have any kind of sense of plot or outline, to not have a sense of an ending, man, you're really flying blind at that point. And sometimes it works. Again, there's really no rules to this, but I think you're making it harder on yourself. And a natural question to ask along these lines is, with regard to your new novel, Bunyan and Henry, you obviously did some outlining. You obviously tried to conceive of the plot before drafting or alongside of the process of drafting. You put a lot of thought and analytical time into trying to build your story well. Do you think that being a plotter and writing an outline for this book, perhaps compared to previous books or compared to friends of yours who don't do this, do you think that it made you more efficient as a writer in terms of the speed with which you were able to get the book written?
Well, it took me about 4 years to write that book. So whatever speed I had was, I mean, I know it took you a long time to write your book as well, but 4 years is not like a wham bam kind of book. I think it helps with speed. I think more what helped was me just having a kind of theory of the case of kind of like the kind of story that I wanted to tell. And, my book is a hero's journey. And I know the hero's journey just just gets people's backs up. They feel like of all the kind of story paradigms that are out there, the hero's journey is probably the least popular among literary types of writers. Certainly
Really?
it's very, oh my God, I think so. I mean, I've gotten comments from people who are sort of like, well, Mark, you write hero's journeys. So, like, we know what you're about. We know you're kind. And it's extremely, it's like a put down. It's like a great little literary cocktail party put down.
But wait, and the hero's journey is the Joseph Campbell thing.
I mean, ish. It's like, I mean, that's sort of like where it all began, is with Joseph Campbell. But it is since then, there's a book called The Writer's Journey by Chris Vogler. And he very famously kind of transitioned Joseph Campbell from what he was, which was like a kind of comparative mythology professor, into a kind of like Hollywood playbook guru, which is something that Campbell like never intended, or I think probably even imagined would become of his work. But it happened. And, the hero's journey, though, kind of like as it's understood today, is like not nearly as kind of weird and particular as all the Joseph Campbell stuff. I mean, reading Joseph Campbell is actually very difficult and it's very academic. But, the way it's understood now is there's this kind of like, you start in a kind of normal world and then you go on this adventure and then you return with the boon, and you win the thing or whatever it is. And there's a number of beats associated with that. But anyway, I mean, I write the hero's journey, and the point I want to make about the hero's journey, because I don't want to belabor it, and I want to caveat again, because people are just so resistant to it as like a valid idea, or so it feels to me. The reason why I like the hero's journey is because it feels true to me. And it feels true to the kind of story that I wanted to tell in this book. The odyssey that Paul Bunyan goes on, is very much a classic hero's journey. And it just so happened that the classic hero's journey had a lot of the emotions built into it. Classic hero's journey is very good at creating the kinds of feelings of ultimate triumph that I wanted to create and the kind of things that I wanted to talk about. I have a friend who writes beach reads, and she has said to me that the beach read is the genre that is best able to express how she feels about life. Okay. Like, there's not a hero's journey in the beach read. It's like four different narrators is like the kind of books that she likes to write. And like they go to like Nantucket for the summer, and there's like relationships, and they talk to each other and they reveal family secrets. She's like, Mark, this is what life is. I mean, it's not my life, but that's like what she thinks life is. And that's great. And it's not a hero's journey at all. And so good for her. And guess what? The Beach Reads has tons of traditional beats and conventions, and she follows them all, and she loves it because the Beach Read is a genre that creates certain kinds of emotions, just as the hero's journey is. So anyway, to answer your question, I felt that my knowledge about the kind of story I wanted to create and the kind of emotions I wanted to create helped me always kind of stay close to the path of the kind of story I wanted to tell and not go too far afield.
So we're talking, to boil it down simplistically into a 3-act structure. for the hero's journey. Like, can we do that? Like, is there a way to sort of articulate what a hero's journey story encapsulates?
Yes. And so I call it the human journey because that just tells you like how kind of like crouched in my shell I am. I'm used to not saying the hero's journey. So I've like come to call it the human journey. And to me, the human journey is actually something that can be applied across even the beach read and kind of any character arc, which is basically that Act 1, the character wants something. Act 2, they try to get it. And Act 3, they either get it or they don't get it. And that's what every story really is, from the Lord of the Rings entire cycle to Mark gets up in the morning and wants to get some coffee and realizes there's no coffee. So then he goes and buys some and then he has coffee. I mean, it's just how stories are basically told.
That's it. And it's I think it's useful. I mean, it's like obviously a simplistic way of looking at it. But sometimes that's exactly what we need, because we get into the weeds of a novel and everything can become very tangled and complicated. And it can be helpful, to me anyway, to sometimes pull back and look at the thing and be like, okay, character wants something, character tries to get it, character either gets it or doesn't get it. That's it.
That's it. And it just repeats and it repeats and repeats and repeats. And like it's in my mind, it should repeat in every chapter. It could repeat multiple times in every chapter. I mean, even chapters that are like 5 pages long. It's just like, this is like, it's something I think that is like hardwired into our lizard brains of like how to kind of order the phenomena of our earthly existence into time. And also to give human agency, right? I mean, the key ingredient is like you have to want something. So you want something, and then after that in time, you tried to get it, and after that in time, you either got it or you didn't, and then you repeat over and over.
So let's talk a little bit more about 3-act structure, just to get like really fundamental about it in terms of length, like the general guidelines for how long a first act is versus how long a second act is versus how long a third act is. Like the second act is the meat of a novel, right? That's the long bit.
Right. So I do have some kind of very specific things to say that are going to sound very much like Save the Cat. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff out there that is like highly specific. Like,
and again, Save the Cat is a book by Blake Snyder about film,
right,
screenwriting,
right,
and story structure in filmmaking.
Yes. Oft derided, but highly influential, highly prescriptive, kind of like your screenplay will be between like 105 and 115 pages long. The inciting incident will happen between page 18 and 22, like that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't agree with any of that stuff, and I'm not a screenwriter, and I don't want to be a screenwriter. So I just like, I'm reluctant about super prescriptive things. But I mean, among the more prescriptive things I would say on this interview is, I just think some rule of thumb that I've gotten is like, the setup of the first act will usually be about 25% of the story. The middle will be about 60%. And then the climax will be about 15%. The key detail there is like, you can really give or take on a lot of that. But I just think the key thing for the climax is that the climax being very short. And just there is a real good reason for that, which is that usually in the climax, the character is going face to face with whatever antagonist or antagonistic force they've been dealing with, like the thing that's stopping them from getting what they want. And that meeting is going to be very high stakes, and it's going to have a binary outcome. It's like either it's going to happen or it's not. And you've been waiting for this moment, the whole story. And so that is going to just ratchet up the level of excitement and tension for the reader. And so you just want to kind of like really pack that punch. If you draw out the confrontation that resolves your story question, it'll just fall flat, and people will, it's just a punchline being like more than about 3 words, right? If your punchline is like 2 sentences long, like you're just going to lose the whole effect of the humor that you built up.
Yeah. Brevity is the soul of wit, right?
Especially at the end. Yeah.
Especially at the end. So
yeah.
Let's talk about you mentioned Blake Snyder and Save the Cat. I actually find that book very helpful in the manner of taking like the rigidity of the screenplay format in terms of what it requires, generally speaking, at least from a commercial perspective, of the writer, and then trying to graft that onto, say, a novel of literary fiction. I think there's a nice tension between those two things.
Yes.
I found it very helpful to sort of diagnose my own books through the lens of a book like that, just to see if I'm hitting any beats or any marks of the
Yeah.
kind of, storytelling tropes and formulas that I think all of us are sort of hardwired to understand as viewers of film and television. And there's something called the inciting incident that is often brought up in screenwriting, but is not as often brought up in the context of, say, literary fiction. And I think that most good stories do have an inciting incident when you get diagnostic about it. No?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say how much I love this word diagnostic that you're using. And I want to reiterate this point that I made earlier because it's so important. Like, these ideas about structure are most helpful and most fruitful when they're used as a diagnostic rather than in the conception stage of the art. Like, when you get really dead BS, like commercial fiction and, Hollywood terrible films, usually what's going on there is they started at tvtropes.org, right? And it wasn't a diagnostic. It was like, oh, I'm going to like steal a bunch of cliche ideas and then like try to write something out of that. I think for me, like the ideal scenario is when you have a full tank of gas and you really have an idea, but the idea is just raw, and sort of marinating your awesome, raw, powerful artistic impulse in these structural ideas after you've got something. That's when you're going to get something that is both raw and emotionally powerful and also like easy to consume and exciting to consume. So I just love it. Just that word diagnostic is just perfect for how I view structural theory intersecting with a raw work of art. But onto this question of the inciting incident. So this is like such an important thing in storytelling, and it's related to two other big theories, which is the normal or concepts, the normal world and the refusal of the call, which is a very Joseph Campbell thing. But I think these three things are like at the heart of a great first act. And part of these ideas, I just want to give a shout out to Michael Arndt. He has another great film online that anybody can watch. It's about 90 minutes long. It's called
And Michael Arndt being the guy who led the creative process for Toy Story 3.
That's right. Yeah. So Michael Arndt, Arndt, two-time Oscar winner, and he has this film called Endings: the Good, the Bad, and the Insanely Great. I mean, I would just say everybody, watch it as soon as you can. It's about 90 minutes. It's some of the best 90 minutes on storytelling that you can watch. It's just on YouTube. You can find it in half a second. But some of the ideas about the inciting incident are expressed in that video and his video about Toy Story 3. He's a really brilliant guy. But here's the thing. So a key to a first act is what's called the normal world. And the normal world, the most important fact about the normal world is that the main character feels that the normal world will go on forever, uninterrupted. Like, I have a clear sense of what my future is. And you can see this in kind of any great first act, but let's just use it kind of in the example that I brought up. It's called Mark's Coffee Adventure. Mark wakes up in the morning and he wants a cup of coffee. And I know that every morning I wake up and there's coffee downstairs, right? That's my normal world. I'm going to go down, make a cup of coffee. Okay. Now the inciting incident is something that ruins the normal world. It makes the normal world impossible to continue. The normal world will never be the same again. Okay, so in this incident, I walk downstairs and I look and there's no coffee. Inciting incident. Okay. And then the third piece of it is the refusal of the call. And that's a very Joseph Campbell kind of term. But the refusal of the call to adventure is what the refusal is. That is you kind of refusing to do anything about what the inciting incident because you are attached to the normal world, or you don't feel like you're strong enough to adventure into the unfamiliar world, or you don't have the means or the time or whatever excuse you want to make. But the quality of this refusal of the call is related to the quality of the normal world. Like if the person really loves the normal world or is like anxiously attached to the normal world, then they will refuse the call a great deal. Like talking about Pixar, like Finding Nemo, right? Like in his normal world, he's going to anxiously protect his little son from the dangers of the open sea. But the inciting incident comes, and I forget exactly what happens. He's like caught by a fisherman or something. And so then he's going to refuse the call because he's like, I'm too afraid and anxious of a person to go brave the open sea. But eventually he does. But so that's it. So, and then in Mark's coffee adventure, just to finish that one up, it's like, now I got to go to the store to go get some coffee, and it's really early in the morning, and I don't want to do it. I'm going to deny that the inciting incident has happened. I'm going to think maybe there still is coffee in the house. And I'm going to look around, and then I'm going to deny that I even want coffee. This is another refusal of the call. I'm going to say, who needs coffee anyway? But then for some reason, if it's a good story, I'll just realize my want is so great that I must venture out into the world and go get coffee. And so the adventure begins. So those are the kind of three real pillars of the first act.
And you have, I think if you looked at any story, novel, film, television episode, you could probably locate an inciting incident.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a fun, we talked about how there's variability in approach and how we all have to sort of become special snowflakes and build our own authentic approach to this. But the inciting incident seems to me like one of the things that's sort of intractable. Like it's a fundamental pillar of the process.
Yes, but there's like good inciting incidents and bad inciting incidents. And so like the thing that makes a great inciting incident is that it's like caused by like the antagonistic force that like the story is about. Like let's say, somebody gets cancer. Cancer is an awful thing, but like cancer is sort of a general inciting incident sometimes. Like it's a bad thing that happens, or like a car accident. That's another one that you often see. But it's like these, like a cancer and a car accident are sort of like completely impossible for a person to like foresee or do anything about. There's like no agency, and it says nothing about the character of the person, right? Now, if the person is in the car accident is got a problem with alcoholism and he's driving drunk, okay, now we're getting somewhere. If the person is a race car driver and they're known for being reckless and on the racetrack and they push it too far and they get in a car accident, okay, well now that's relevant. But if it's like, I'm trying to say that like the inciting incident should be related to the kinds of antagonism and the kinds of forces that the person will be contending with for the rest of the story. It shouldn't be general.
Okay. So I think what we're kind of headed towards is like a discussion of the inner life. Like I think so much of what we've talked about so far with respect to structure and so much of the general like tendency when it comes to conversations around structure is to think of these sort of external story fundamentals, the kind of exoskeleton.
Mm-hmm.
But there is an inner arc that good story structure has to tend to as well. Like the character work that happens subsurface and that we give the reader access to in, say, a novel is every bit as vital.
Oh, yeah. So one way to think about that is another kind of classic storytelling tool, an analytical tool, and that the character begins with what's called the lie the character believes, and then they end with the truth the character needs. And that is sort of the journey, the inner journey of the character, and it's really like what the story is about. So I could like give you some examples. So like Star Wars, the original one. The lie the character believes is, I can probably get by as a moisture farmer without ever going to flight school. I can like keep putting that off. And the truth the character needs that they discover at the end is, if I follow the way of the Jedi, I can defeat the evil empire. And so you take that and somebody says like, hey, what's that new movie about? Oh, it's about this guy who's like stuck as a farmer, but he ends up mastering this thing and defeating the evil empire. And right there, you see, you've just kind of unified the lie the character believes and the ultimate truth that they get. And then lo and behold, you have a description of what the story is fundamentally about. And let's just take another one, like Eat, Pray, Love. The lie is, I think I can be happy in a conventional domestic setting. And what is the truth the character needs at the end? By living a courageous, authentic life, despite what other people may think, I can find my own place in the world. Something like that. Like, that's the journey of this woman. Or The Godfather. I think by having a family values approach to being a mobster, I can make my family legitimate. That's like the lie that the Corleone family believes. But in the end, the truth is, the only way to preserve the family business is to be more violent than everybody else. Okay, that's a kind of a dark arc, but that tells you what the story is. And then I'm just going to give like one more, like the story of the Buddha, right? Just take something like from not real literature, like traditional literature. The lie the Buddha believes at the beginning of that story is, I think I can lead a happy life by ignoring and denying that there is suffering and death and disease in the world. And the truth at the end is, I can defeat suffering and disease and the idea of death by following this eightfold path and reaching nirvana, right? So I'll stop there, but you can do that for like any good story. And it just, this lie the character believes to the truth that they ultimately win by their struggle. That is, quote, what the story is about.
And it's a story of change. I mean, it goes back to what we were
Story
talking
of change. Yep.
Once they get to the truth that they need, they've gone through a process of fundamental and necessary change. And that, like, if it's rendered well, is satisfying to read.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what good story does. And something that you talked about earlier, and I want to kind of underline it a little bit more, is the fact that there are these structural, like, necessities or fundamentals that good stories tend to have in various combinations. But it's a situation where it's kind of like a Russian nesting doll type deal where, yes, you want to look at your project from 30,000 feet. You know, you want to look at your novel as an entire entity and think of it in 3 acts, like beginning, middle, and end. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Certain things need to happen. But then within that novel, there are sections, chapters, passages. You know, it depends how people do it. But you want to have a lot of the fundamentals that apply at a kind of global level also apply at a granular level.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, when you're analyzing an individual section or chapter of your book, there might be like an Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 sort of structure that applies to it too, right?
Absolutely. Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, totally. And it's like, that's, I mean, everything I said about like the lie the character believes in Mark's coffee journey and the truth Mark ultimately, you know, maybe my struggle is I have to go to 3 different coffee shops. And the truth is, if you are persistent enough, you can have coffee this morning. Like, that's like the truth that I needed after my struggle. You know, that could be like 5 sentences of an opening paragraph of some chapter, right? And then you have a 3-act kind of wanted something, tried to get it, got it, or didn't get it. Yes, the Russian nesting doll over and over. And just know, we're talking about book matter and story matter. That's all story matter. Okay. So say you do the Mark's coffee adventure for 5 sentences. And then you're like, here's what Mark's house looked like. And here is like a list of books that were on Mark's shelf. And here's a description of the brand of sneakers that Mark was wearing. So there was 3 beats of book matter, right? But the coffee thing was a story matter item, you know?
And what we're talking about is giving a character within the context of the larger project, but also within the context of chapters, sections, the kind of micro matter that you build your book from. You're giving your character goals. And those goals change and like inform, like the goal of chapter 1, whether it's realized or not realized, should then inform chapter 2. Like, there is a build and a causality that you're trying to integrate into your story, correct?
Yes, because so let's say in Mark's coffee adventure, and I'm just using it just to kind of show that like even the most mundane things can fall into 3-act structure. Let's say the first act of my book is actually that I'm trying to get a promotion at my job, and that happens at noon. That meeting of whether I get the promotion or not happens at noon. And in the book is about how I'm going to find a new career for myself. And guess what? Not only am I not going to get the promotion at noon, but I'm going to get fired. But that coffee thing, which is the beginning of the first chapter, is sort of like the beginning of that day, right? And so then there's all these kind of like micro 3 acts that are building up. And let's say the reason why I blow it at the noon meeting is because because I was so rushed and nervous that I bought the wrong kind of coffee, or I brought decaf coffee. And so I didn't wake up enough. And so then I almost got in an accident. And then I had to like stop on the way to the office and like talk to a police officer. And then I'm late for the thing, and on and on and on. And every one of those little beats is like a 3-act thing, but it adds up to the Russian nesting doll, as you aptly described it, of like kind of the state of mind for the climax of Act 1, which was me blowing the meeting and getting fired. And then that will be the inciting incident that ruins my normal world because I expected to get this job. Then there will be a refusal of the call where I'll say, maybe I can get my job back. Maybe they don't mean it. Maybe I don't need a job. But then I will have to ultimately accept the call to adventure and proceed into Act 2, which is where I will try to find something new to do with my life.
So one of the, I think, more fun exercises to take yourself through when you're trying to build like a really sound story structure is to write like what in filmmaking is called a beat sheet.
Yeah.
And to try to create a solid sense of true causality from chapter to chapter, beat to beat, section to section. And I think I just talked about this with Steve Almond. I think I've talked about this on the show before, but I do think it came up in my conversation with Steve recently.
Yeah, it did.
Where when you're talking about like effective causality, there's a difference between like saying this happened and then this happens and then this happens versus this happens in spite of X or because of Y. Like, can you just drill down into that a little bit more? It's a very good lesson that bears repeating.
Yeah, it really is. So I also have a podcast, nowhere near as successful as yours, but I do have an author interview show called The Thoughtful Bro, and I interviewed George Saunders on it. And I asked George Saunders on that show he's got the most famous creative writing class in the country at Syracuse University. And he's seen so many famous and talented, gifted people in that class. I said, what is it that tells you when you see a student in your class that they're going to make it as an author? And he said 2 things. First, a willingness to revise. So that's pretty standard, maybe easy to understand. But the second thing was so weird and particular that I always talk about it. It's like one of my favorite literary pieces of advice ever. And he said, the second thing that tells me whether a writer will succeed or not is an attention to causality. It was just so specific. I've thought about it ever since. But he's talking about this very thing that you're talking about, which is you have a beat sheet, like you said. And if what's uniting the 2 things is and then, what that means is that there isn't a strong character drive behind what's causing the events, right? So let's take a situation where the antagonist is like really vague and really strong. Like say, there's like a tsunami, right? And it's like, well, that person woke up and the tsunami was coming and then they ran and then the tsunami destroyed the city and then the tsunami covered them and then they drowned, right? But it's like there's no like because of that or in spite of that, which are like the 2 great connectors and which show that the character has agency and is driving the action, right? I mean, you want a story where it's like, a person woke up and got on a plane to France and to start their new career. And, in spite of that, this happened, because I'm sort of like getting lost in this analogy here, but I'm making up on the fly. But the point is, it's like you just want somebody who is reaching an obstacle, like they can't speak French, and in spite of that, they went anyway. And because they couldn't speak French, they got into a French class, and because of that, they hit it off with the French teacher. And in spite of the fact that he couldn't speak, she took pity on him and took him out to dinner or something, right? And it's just, it's always like the character is doing something that causes the next domino to fall.
That's it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to antagonists, like I think that this can get a little bit blurry for people writing literary fiction because, you know, there might not be a conventional boogeyman or bad guy. The antagonist might be something internal. It might be some social pressure or cultural thing. Like, you know what I'm saying? It can get a little bit murkier. But when you talk about building a good antagonist and how an antagonist works on a story's structural integrity, like, are there any keys that you would want to like underline for people?
So one of the big things is what I was just talking about, the tsunami. Like, you've got to have an antagonist that's like the right level of strength. So a great story is a story where the person is pushed beyond their normal life and kind of pushed to an extreme. Like they want something, the desire's got to be there. Like they want to win a gold medal at the Olympics. Okay. But, so they're willing to kind of do anything to get it. And maybe in another year, they're such a gifted swimmer that they would have just won the gold medal. But this year, there's an incredible, swimmer from Spain, and it's like this person that nobody's ever heard of, and here they are. There's this like wonderkind, right? And now this person who thought they were going to walk to the gold medal is going to be pushed to the absolute limit of their endurance, and maybe they're even going to try to cheat or take steroids, or they're going to consider it, all because there is this antagonist that is like just the right strength, right? If that swimmer, this wonderkind from Spain, was so good that he couldn't, the person would lose by like a lap every time, it's not interesting. They're just going to lose. And if the person is too easy to beat, then it's like, who cares, right? But if they're just strong enough, like you will find this in all great climaxes, right? I mean, just to pick one off the top of my head, like, Hector and Achilles, right? I mean, Hector, one of the great antagonists of world literature. He's so awesome. He's like a great dad. He's like a great husband. He's super handsome. Like everybody loves him. He's got like a code of ethics. And like Achilles, is like, doesn't really sort of want to fight him at the beginning, but it's only when Hector kills, Achilles' boyfriend, Patroclus, that Achilles is finally like, okay, I got to deal with this guy. And then they have this like epic fight. And like, that's what you want. You want somebody who is just going to draw the very best out of the protagonist.
And so when it comes to the stakes of a story, like you talk about protagonist, antagonist, the tension there, you talk about inciting incident and the normal world of the protagonist shifting irrevocably. You talk about a character having goals and needing to either realize them or not. You talk about the character kind of living a lie and getting the truth that they need. When it comes to effective storytelling, what are your thoughts on stakes? Because I've seen it done all sorts of different ways. There can be really sort of traditionally dramatic stakes to a narrative, like, will the murderer get caught? Will the detective solve the crime? That might be like a really kind of easy example. But sometimes I think in literary fiction, there can be subtler stakes that are like every bit as powerful in their way, but might not have the sort of external glitz of like a murder investigation or something. It could be somebody trying to just get out of their own way or find like an ounce of hope. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it can be
Totally.
it could be something like that. And so, but I think the stakes still matter. Like the reader has to really powerfully feel them, even if they are not maybe externally flashy.
Well, look, man, I mean, let's just take your example right there of literary fiction where like the person is just like looking to get out of their own way, like a kind of more subtle, seemingly small stakes kind of story. I mean, to me, that's not per se small stakes at all, nor is it per se less interesting than like, will the serial killer be stopped? It's all about how well it's drawn, and it's all about how well the world is set up in the first act and how compelling it is. I mean, if the person, I'm just kind of riffing here, but it's like the person needs to get out of their own way, right? So what I would need to see in the first act is the reason why they are getting in their own way, right? Let's see some examples of that. And that's the normal world. And they basically come to a point in their life where they're like, I'm okay with getting in my way as it is. Like, I don't really want to change. But then what will happen at the inciting incident is something will shatter their world in such a way that like he will have gotten in his own way so much that it's actually putting something else. Like now, my marriage is going to fall apart because of this way that I'm getting in my own way. And we will see by the way the character is drawn that marriage is really important to him. And so then he'll finally realize, I need to change and stop getting in my own way so I can save my marriage. And then he'll begin his odyssey, whether that's therapy or I'm not going to drink anymore, or I'm going to get in shape and lose 80 pounds, whatever the thing is that he thinks he needs to do to get back to a healthy marriage, because that's actually more important to him than this little neurotic way that he's kind of accepted a life of getting in his own way. And so then he'll change. So all I'm trying to say is that like any story, if it's properly set up with the stakes and in the normal world, can have a totally compelling arc. But just to get back to your question about stakes. So the way this is, now I'm going to go into teacher mode, but it's like the way I think about stakes is there's the 4 P's of stakes, easy to remember. There's personal, professional, and physical. Okay. And then the last one is philosophical, but that one is a little bit different. But just quickly, personal stakes are about relationships, like, am I going to, my marriage, my kid, my father, my friend, what is that? If that relationship might break or might become something new, that's what's at stake. Like that's very common in romance and family drama. The stakes are the relationships between the people. Physical stakes is sort of far more common, and obvious to understand. It's like, will I live or die? And any action kind of story is about physical danger. And then professional is, it's about, will I do the thing that it is like my task to do? And it might sound very kind of corporate, right? Like, will I become partner? I mean, that is a kind of story, but it's also like any detective who like wants to solve a crime. Like that's his job. Any knight kind of from the 12th century whose job it is to go defeat the monster. I mean, like that will have some physical stakes in it, but that's also sort of a professional job. It's like, because if you don't do it, you're not going to be a knight anymore. Like you're going to be, demoted or whatever, right? Or kind of any war story where you're on a mission. Like, will you do the job or not? That's a professional stakes. Now, philosophical stakes, and this is something, again, I credit to Michael Arndt. This is the first time I heard this idea, but I think it's great, is about like whose worldview is going to win. And so like, you have a protagonist who like, plays by the book, right? And then you've got an antagonist who's like willing to cheat. And so, you might have in a positive kind of story, it's like the guy who plays by the book ultimately wins. I mean, that's fine. There's lots of stories like that. But I mean, The Godfather is an example of kind of like a negative character arc where it's actually the family has been trying to avoid real violence and kind of sort of have a code, but it's Michael's willingness to break the code and become the most violent of all that causes him to win. So kind of the message, and often the message of a story is very tied up in the philosophical stakes of the story, like who wins at the end and what philosophy do they have. That is like intimately tied to what the artist is quote unquote trying to say. And like sort of what is being said at the end of The Godfather is, in this world of the mafia, in this time period in New York, this is what it takes to succeed. And it's a dark message, but that's the truth of that film.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, not to get too philosophical, but I feel like that's like an allegory for like the broader American project, like how to succeed in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Like, too often it's, you have to be willing to kind of go low or be more cutthroat than the competition, basically, in order to take over.
It's true. But I mean, I think, you look at a movie like The Untouchables and like, then you have like the opposite. It's right. It's like Elliot Ness, who's just like this kind of straight and narrow dude. I mean, he's the one who succeeds in that film. And so, you know, I mean, you can kind of write any kind of, so you can say anything you want, but just know that where your story lands, like if your character succeeds or fails, and at the end, by the end of that story, we'll know what values they have. Like philosophical stakes are about values. And like what the artist is saying is, these are the values that cause a person to either win or lose in the world that I've shown you. And that's the sort of message of my story.
Well, we'll end on a Toy Story note, since it's come up a lot in this conversation. It's a Pixar finish, but there is a Pixar fairy tale structure exercise that I know you're a fan of. And I think it's the kind of sort of fundamental assessment that we could all stand to do, whatever kind of book or screenplay or whatever we're writing. Can you just describe what the Pixar fairy tale structure exercise is?
Yeah. And really, I mean, like Brad and I have been saying on this, I mean, those Pixar guys just take storytelling so seriously. And I'm going to hit the caveat again because it's so important. Pixar actually has a saying called tools, not rules. Like, these are just tools. The moment a tool feels oppressive to you, or like if you hear this exercise we're about to do and you think, like, it doesn't make me want to write at all, then just run away from it. But if instead you hear this and there's some little spark in you and you're like, ooh, that sounds interesting, then run toward it. You know, it's all about artists. It's so unpredictable and so subtle what motivates an artist to be artistic. And so I don't have the secret of what inspires everybody. But this might inspire you. It might not. Only use it if you like it. But so there's kind of a technique that they use at Pixar that are kind of like a saying, like, if you can't boil it down to a fairy tale that like a 6-year-old could understand, then you probably don't understand your own story. And they have a 6-step fairy tale kind of fill in the blank that you can use. So I'll read it once just with the blanks, and then I'll read it again and fill in kind of the kind of thing that should go in the blank. But here we go. So once upon a time, there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. So with kind of traditional terminology, here's how you would fill that in. Once upon a time, there was protagonist. Every day, describe the protagonist's normal world and expectations. One day, this is the inciting incident that destroys the normal world. Because of that, this is the decisive act which leads into Act 2. Because of that, these are all the escalations in Act 2, the struggles and the main journey, until finally, ultimate confrontation with the antagonist. So that's how you do it. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll just quickly fill it in with Mark's coffee adventure, right? Once upon a time, there was Mark. Every day, Mark woke up and made coffee. One day, there was no coffee left. Because of that, Mark decided to drive to the store to get some coffee. Because of that, he realized that store was closed and the other store was closed. And even the third store didn't have any coffee left until finally Mark went to the fourth store, bought some coffee, and came home. So you can apply this to any genre, any kind of story. It's just kind of a classic development of this basic micro unit of storytelling that is similar to what I was saying about want something, try to get the thing, and either you get it or you don't.
I think it's not dissimilar to like wanting to be able to clarify an elevator pitch or a log line for a screenplay or a novel. Like, if you can't tell somebody easily in a line or 2 or 3 what your book is about, you might not have a handle on it.
Right.
Like, it's not reductive in a bad way. Like, I think it's actually a useful, I mean, I try to do that, you know? And if you get ready to go out to do media for your book, once it's published, you're going to have to do it. So it's worth trying to do, even if only for that purpose. You know, people are going to constantly be asking you to talk about it. And I think you end up getting pretty good at it at a certain point, right?
And not only that, Brad, but I mean, I just, you know, if you can fill this out, right? And so like a lot of the time I'm in kind of workshops with people, and people like say they submit the first 50 pages of their book, and I'm trying to give them feedback on it. And they say like, is this a good beginning? And I'm like, well, what happens like at the end? Like, how does the book end, roughly speaking? And they're like, well, I don't really know. I was hoping maybe you would have some ideas or whatever. And I'm like, I have zero idea how to tell you if this opening is working if I don't know what the end of the book is, because how your book ends is going to tell me like, oh, okay, well that will help me know like what the lie the character believes is, and kind of like what the normal world is that they're going to have to depart from, because I'll know where they're headed and all of which is to say, if a person can simply do this Pixar exercise about their main protagonist story, then a cascade of things start to happen. You're able to then properly structure the first act in the normal world. You're able to identify the inciting incident. You're able to identify like who the antagonist is. I mean, if you can do this, you are like, halfway home in terms of being able to structure your novel.
So last thing I'll ask is regarding, and by the way, speaking of Pixar, the name of the author of the book that I mentioned earlier, I think came to me. Again, the book is called Creativity Inc., and the author is Ed Catmull, I want to say, Catmull. Right. Yeah. And I think that's his name anyway. I know his name's Ed. But
that's right.
When it comes to like resources, books that you really appreciate in the story structure and storytelling, like craft book genre, you've mentioned a few, but can you just repeat and share some of those names
Absolutely.
with listeners so people can kind of walk away from this conversation with some resources?
Yeah. So, and again, caveating, only use what works for you. These are the people I'm about to mention are very different from each other, and they often like really disagree with each other as well. Like Robert McKee was on my show, and he said the hero's journey is complete bullshit, and Joseph Campbell was wrong about just about everything. I mean, like that's a little bit of like kind of alpha males fighting, but you can find a lot of disagreement among those people. So try to just find something that works for you. But one of my favorite people is KM Weiland. She has this website called Helping Writers Become Authors. She also has a podcast. She puts out these little like 15-minute kind of like how to talk about the lie your character believes, or how to write a great climax. And she's just this like lovely woman from Nebraska. And she has this like kind of very soothing voice. It's just like drinking a cup of tea. Anyway, her insights about character arcs are just amazing, and they're so clearly stated. Highest recommendation on KM Weiland. Michael Arndt, you've heard me talk about him. If you just plug his name into YouTube, you'll find some of his videos about storytelling. Robert McKee. I find Robert McKee, I mean, he's sort of one of the leading figures, if not the leading figure, certainly in Hollywood, as a kind of story guru. I find his books are like okay. I find the best way to experience Robert McKee is actually to listen to his lectures. It's just like kind of, he does these seminars, but he also does webinars that you can just, that are much cheaper than his big seminar. But he's just very, very good at kind of like off the cuff insights more than he is good at kind of systematic thinking, in my opinion. So that's Robert McKee. Chris Vogler, The Writer's Journey. That is the distillation of Joseph Campbell for like the everyday person, which totally is me. Like I've tried to read Joseph Campbell. I sort of can't get through it. But Chris Vogler is like, okay, here's what it means if you're actually in the storytelling business. And he boils it all down with examples. That book is called The Writer's Journey by Chris Vogler. Then two final ones is I took a class with a woman named Jean Cavellos at the Odyssey Writing Workshop. She was great. If you can get into one of her classes, you have to like apply for it. But she taught a course called 3-Act Structure for the fantasy genre, which was really influential for me. And then the last one, which is like a little bit more obscure, is called Props, Morphology of the Folktale. This guy, Vladimir Prop. You can actually go online. If you put that in, you'll be able to find, he's identified, like he analyzed like 800 Russian folktales. And then he identified like sort of like 33 beats of that they all, like many of them have in common. Like it would say like, folktale 179 did beats 1, 4, 7, 10, 11, 12, and so on, right? And this other one did only 2, 10, 13, and 14. But the point is, it's just a beat sheet for like a classic fairy tale. And I just feel like any story you're telling, just go and check Vladimir Proft's folktale list and just see, like, do any of these give you any idea for like a new beat for your story? Like the villain comes to the house of the protagonist is like sort of an early one. Very specific, but maybe your antagonist should show up earlier in your story than they do. Anyway, highly recommend all of those. Just find what works for you.
All right. Thank God for the nerds breaking down folktales, right?
Right.
But it's great to talk with you. This has been super helpful. And congratulations on Bunyan and Henry, your new novel.
Thank
and
you.
Your podcast is called The Thoughtful Bro.
Yep.
It's out there. So people should check that out. And they should just reach out to you and like badger you about this stuff. So, and ask you for help. I'm sure you'll be more than willing to field their questions.
I tend to get too easily roped into these kinds of conversations. I get so excited about it. So
yeah. Well, it's great to talk with you, and I really appreciate the time.
It's great to be here. It's an honor. I love your show.